The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the iron tracks was hypnotic, a steady heartbeat that seemed to echo through the quiet carriage. Outside, the world blurred into streaks of silver and black, the moonlight glancing off the rails in fleeting flashes. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old leather seats, polished wood, and something else, something that made her pulse quicken every time she caught it. Clara sat by the window, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the edge of the small table before her. She had chosen this compartment for its solitude, expecting nothing more than a long night's journey to her destination. But from the moment the train had departed, the electricity in the air suggested that tonight would be anything but ordinary. She was conscious of every subtle sound, the soft rustle of the newspaper in the opposite corner, the distant hum of conversation from the next carriage, and, most disturbingly, the quiet, deliberate steps of someone moving closer. "Is this seat taken?" a deep, smooth voice asked, drawing her gaze upward. She looked to see a man standing just inside the carriage, a tall figure framed by the dim light. His eyes were dark, almost impossibly so, and they seemed to pierce straight through her, reading her hesitation before she could even acknowledge it. A faint, knowing smile tugged at his lips, one that sent a shiver down her spine. "No, no, please," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, gesturing to the seat across from her. He slid into the seat with a grace that betrayed practiced ease, yet his presence was magnetic, overwhelming. Clara could feel the heat radiating off him, subtle at first, then intensifying with every passing second. It wasn't just the warmth of his body, it was the aura he carried, a dangerous, intoxicating energy that made her stomach tighten and her thoughts scatter. For a while, silence stretched between them. The clacking wheels provided a rhythm, but the tension was palpable, like the air before a storm. Clara's eyes drifted to his hands, noticing how effortlessly he rested them on his knees, the faint flash of a ring on his finger, and the way the light caught the contours of his face. She could feel herself drawn in, unwillingly, like metal to a magnet. "I don't usually travel alone," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. "It can be lonely." Clara offered a small smile, unsure if it was polite or genuine. "I often enjoy solitude," she replied. Her own words sounded fragile even to her, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. He leaned slightly forward, his gaze locking onto hers with a slow, deliberate intensity. "Solitude is comforting, but sometimes," he paused, his smile deepening, "sometimes it can be terribly lonely." A subtle warmth crept up her neck, a flush she couldn't hide. Her heart beat a little faster, matching the rhythm of the train as if it too sensed the spark between them. She looked away briefly, pretending to admire the passing scenery, but her mind refused to wander. It was trapped, caught in the pull of his presence, and she didn't want to escape. The train swayed gently, a subtle motion that seemed to mirror the unspoken tension that hung between them. He shifted slightly, closing the distance without actually moving closer, the air charged with anticipation. Clara's breath hitched, though she tried to mask it as a small cough. "May I?" he asked softly, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. She swallowed hard, unsure what he meant, yet instinctively knew. The answer hovered on the tip of her tongue, unspoken, dangerous in its honesty. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, and the simple gesture seemed to acknowledge a truth neither had yet dared to voice. The carriage felt smaller now, the walls pressing closer, the shadows longer, the heat between them undeniable. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, indifferent to the silent fire igniting within. Clara realized, with a mix of dread and desire, that nothing about this journey would be ordinary. And that was just the beginning. The train rattled onward, its motion steady, hypnotic, carrying Clara deeper into a night that felt both intimate and infinite. She tried to focus on the fleeting lights outside her window, but every glance toward him pulled her attention back. He had introduced himself simply as Julian, but there was something in the way he said it, slow and deliberate, that made it feel like a promise and a challenge. He leaned back in his seat, one arm casually draped over the top of the bench, the other resting near the table. It was a posture of ease, yet the energy radiating from him was anything but relaxed. Clara felt the pull in her chest, a magnetic tension she hadn't experienced in years. She had thought solitude was comforting, yet now, with Julian across from her, she realized how heavy the absence of connection could be and how dangerously thrilling it was when connection arrived unexpectedly. "You travel often?" he asked, breaking the silence, his eyes never leaving hers. Clara hesitated. "Occasionally," she said. "Mostly for work. It's tiring." She smiled faintly, trying to keep the conversation casual, though every word felt charged, every syllable a spark. Julian's gaze softened, just slightly, but it was enough to make her chest tighten. "I know that feeling," he murmured. "Long hours, constant movement, yet somehow, nights like this make it all feel different." Clara's lips parted slightly. "Different how?" she asked, a shiver creeping along her spine. She could feel it, the subtle warmth, the electricity that seemed to pulse in the narrow space between them. He leaned in just a fraction, so little that it was almost imperceptible, yet she felt it as if a current had passed through her. "I don't know, more alive, I suppose," he said. His voice was low, intimate, each word deliberate, like he was sharing a secret meant only for her. "Sometimes, meeting someone unexpectedly can change everything." Clara's breath hitched. Her pulse raced, a mix of apprehension and excitement. She was acutely aware of the closeness, of the way his presence filled the carriage. Every subtle gesture, a lean of his shoulder, the tilt of his head, the way his eyes lingered made it impossible for her to think clearly. And she didn't want to think. The train swayed gently, and Julian's hand brushed against hers as he reached for his glass of water. It was fleeting, almost accidental, but the heat of that touch lingered far longer than it should have. Clara felt the warmth spreading through her, a slow burn that made her cheeks flush. She tried to mask it by pretending to adjust her scarf, but she couldn't hide the way her fingers trembled just slightly. "You have a fire about you," he said softly, his voice low and steady, almost a whisper. "Even in this quiet. I can feel it." Clara looked down at her hands, then back up, meeting his gaze. The intensity in his eyes was overwhelming. It was not just curiosity, it was desire, hunger, a pull that she could feel deep in her bones. She realized with a thrill that he felt it too. Julian leaned closer again, his shoulder nearly brushing hers now. The proximity was intoxicating, and Clara's heart leaped as if it were trying to escape her chest. The carriage felt impossibly small, the world outside distant and irrelevant. Every sense was heightened, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the faint scent of his cologne, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him in waves. "Clara," he said, her name like a caress, deliberate and slow. "Do you feel it too?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let her gaze linger on his lips, the slight curve at the corners, the way the light caught the shadow beneath his cheekbones. She felt herself leaning forward ever so slightly, drawn to him in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Yes," she whispered finally, her voice trembling with honesty. "I feel it." Julian's lips curved into a smile, small but knowing, almost predatory in its subtlety. The air between them was thick, charged, a living thing that seemed to hum with possibility. Neither of them moved for a long moment, both savoring the tension, the anticipation, the undeniable pull that had been building since they first locked eyes. The train's clatter, once just a background rhythm, now seemed to echo the rapid thrum of her heartbeat. Outside, the night pressed on, endless and dark. Inside the carriage, the heat between them was no longer subtle. It was palpable, undeniable, a promise that whatever this night held, it would not be ordinary. And as the train raced forward, Clara realized that she was no longer thinking about solitude. She was thinking only about him and the fire that had been ignited with a single glance. The train's sway grew slightly more pronounced as it wound through a series of curves, the gentle rocking echoing the restless energy that had taken over Clara's thoughts. She kept her gaze fixed outside the window, though every instinct in her body screamed to turn back toward Julian. The space between them felt electric, a taut wire stretched tight, ready to spark at the slightest touch. Julian watched her carefully, his eyes following her every movement with a subtle intensity that made her pulse skip. He reached across the table, a slow, deliberate motion, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was almost intimate, and Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. She dared not breathe too loudly, as if the sound of her own heartbeat might betray the fire building inside her. "You're quiet," Julian said softly, his voice low, rumbling against the fragile silence. "I like it. But I wonder what's going on in that mind of yours." Clara's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. How could she explain the torrent of sensations swirling inside her? The subtle warmth of his presence, the magnetic pull of his gaze, the way her skin tingled at the brush of his fingers, how could she put that into words? He smiled faintly, leaning back just a fraction, though the tension in his posture suggested the opposite. "I can tell," he murmured, his voice threading around her consciousness. "You're fighting it, the pull. But there's no need to fight tonight." Clara swallowed hard. She wasn't sure if it was fear, desire, or the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Every instinct screamed caution, yet another part of her urged surrender. The carriage, the night, the rhythmic clatter of the train, it all seemed to conspire to leave them alone in this bubble of suspended reality, where nothing existed but the two of them. The faint click of the compartment door startled her for a moment, but Julian's hand reached out, resting lightly over hers. The warmth of his touch was grounding yet dangerous, an anchor that tethered her while simultaneously pulling her closer. Clara's fingers twitched beneath his palm, her pulse flaring with each subtle movement, each glance, each unspoken word. "Do you trust me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question wasn't rhetorical, it hung in the air, heavy and daring. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Trust. She had built walls around herself, carefully, meticulously. But there was something about him, a quiet command, a raw intensity that made those walls tremble. She hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly, her eyes locking with his. "That's good," he murmured, his lips curling into a smile that sent a thrill up her spine. "Because I think tonight, we're going to leave more than just footprints on this train." She shivered, a combination of anticipation and something deeper, more primal. The words were daring, tantalizing, yet not overtly reckless. Julian had a way of speaking that teased the imagination, drawing her into the orbit of his presence without a single overt action. But the tension between them was undeniable, coiling tighter with every glance, every shared breath. The train began to slow slightly, the rhythmic clatter softening into a muted rattle. Clara's gaze flicked briefly to the dimly lit interior of the compartment, where shadows stretched along the walls, elongating the moments, making the small space feel both intimate and infinite. Julian's hand remained over hers, a subtle claim, a promise, a tease. "I've always found these late-night journeys interesting," Julian continued, his voice low and hypnotic. "They're different. The world outside fades away, leaving only what's necessary, only what matters." His eyes held hers, unwavering, filled with a quiet hunger that made her stomach tighten. Clara felt heat pooling in her chest, spreading in waves through her limbs. She wanted to speak, to articulate the storm inside her, but words failed her. All she could do was meet his gaze, letting the silence speak for her, letting the tension between them thicken into something almost tangible. Julian leaned slightly closer, his shoulder brushing hers, a deliberate closeness that made her pulse stutter. "You feel it too," he whispered, the certainty in his tone both comforting and dangerous. "Yes," Clara breathed, barely audible, her voice trembling with both restraint and surrender. A slow smile spread across Julian's face, one that spoke of satisfaction, of recognition, of anticipation. The space between them crackled with energy, the heat of desire, and the magnetic pull of two people teetering on the edge of something irresistible. The train continued onward, cutting through the night, carrying them together into a world where time seemed suspended, where only the warmth between them existed, and where Clara realized with both fear and thrill that she was powerless to resist. And as the moonlight streamed through the window, casting shadows over their faces, she knew that the journey had only just begun. The train lurched slightly, the sudden movement sending a ripple through Clara's body, a sharp reminder of the confined space they shared. Her hand, still resting under Julian's, felt the heat radiating from him in a way that was almost unbearable. Every nerve in her body seemed alert, every sense heightened, as if the carriage itself had become a chamber of anticipation. Julian's eyes flicked down to their hands, then back up, holding her gaze with a steady intensity that made her stomach twist with desire. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch, thick and deliberate, a quiet test of will. Clara felt her heart hammering, each beat echoing in the confined space, each breath shared in almost imperceptible rhythm with his. "You're trembling," he observed softly, his voice low and intimate, a statement more than a question. Clara swallowed, unsure what to say. The words escaped her, they were unnecessary. The truth was written all over her body, in the slight shiver of her fingers, in the heat in her cheeks, in the quickening of her pulse. Julian didn't need her to explain. He could feel it too, the pull that had been building since their first meeting, a force impossible to resist. He leaned closer, just enough for the warmth of his breath to brush against her cheek. It was subtle, teasing, yet it ignited something deep inside her. Clara's eyes fluttered closed for a brief moment, savoring the sensation, the anticipation, the slow, deliberate closeness. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, a mixture of fear and longing coursing through her veins. "I've wanted this since the moment we sat down," Julian murmured, his words deliberate, low, carrying a weight that made her shiver. "I've been waiting for you to feel it too." Clara's eyes opened, meeting his once more. "I do," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet charged with urgency. "I feel it. I can't. I can't stop it." Julian's smile was slow, a predator's patience in its subtlety, a promise hidden beneath its calm surface. He reached for her other hand, intertwining their fingers, and the simple connection sent an electric current racing along her arm. She couldn't look away. She didn't want to, Every glance, every touch, every shared breath seemed to pull them closer to an invisible precipice. The carriage felt smaller now, the space between them almost unbearable, the air thick with heat and unspoken desire. Julian shifted slightly, leaning in so that their shoulders touched, their knees brushing under the table. Clara's breath hitched, the contact sending a jolt of awareness straight to her core. She could feel his warmth, the subtle pressure, the way he seemed to mold the space around her, drawing her in effortlessly. "Do you know how intoxicating you are?" he whispered, his lips dangerously close to her ear, his words sending a shiver down her spine. "Even when you don't speak, even when you don't move, you're irresistible." Clara's fingers tightened around his, a mixture of nervousness and need. "Julian," she breathed, her voice trembling, a confession and an invitation wrapped in a single sound. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he let his thumb trace slow, deliberate circles over the back of her hand, a touch light enough to tease yet heavy with intent. The heat between them built steadily, a slow burn that seemed to consume every rational thought. She could feel the pull, the undeniable magnetism, and she realized she no longer wanted to resist. The train swayed again, and Julian's knee brushed hers more deliberately this time, a subtle claim that made her heart race. She tilted her head slightly, instinctively leaning toward him, feeling the space shrink until there was nothing between them but shared air and growing tension. Julian's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, reading every flicker of emotion, every hint of anticipation. The unspoken understanding hung in the air. One moment, one touch, could change everything. Clara's breath hitched, and she realized with a thrill that she wanted it, wanted him, more than she had anticipated. The heat in the carriage wasn't just the closeness of their bodies, it was the raw, undeniable electricity of two people who had found each other in a place that should have been ordinary, but had become extraordinary. Julian leaned in slightly, a slow, measured movement that left their faces inches apart. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears, each second stretched into eternity, each heartbeat a drum roll leading to the inevitable. The carriage felt suspended in time, the world outside reduced to darkness and motion, irrelevant and distant. And in that suspended, charged silence, Clara realized that she was no longer a passive passenger on this journey. She was part of it, entwined with him, drawn into a heat that neither of them could resist. The first real moment of closeness had arrived and nothing would ever be the same. The train slowed slightly as it rounded a gentle bend, but Clara felt none of the motion. Every nerve in her body was attuned solely to Julian. The small space between them had become electric, charged with an intensity that neither of them could or wanted to ignore. She could feel his warmth radiating against her, a steady pulse of desire that mirrored her own. Julian's gaze lingered on her face, moving slowly from her eyes to her lips, then back again. The air in the carriage felt impossibly thick, heavy with anticipation and something more primal, a magnetic force drawing them together. Clara's chest rose and fell in uneven rhythms, her pulse quickened, and she realized that she could no longer fight it. Without a word, Julian leaned closer, closing the distance between them. Clara's breath caught as the faint brush of his lips hovered over hers, a teasing promise of what was to come. Her eyes fluttered closed, and she felt her body respond, leaning instinctively toward him, drawn to the heat and the tension that had been building for hours. When his lips finally met hers, it was slow, deliberate, a gentle exploration that sent shivers through her entire body. The contact was electrifying, igniting a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface since they first met. She felt her fingers tighten around his, needing the connection, craving the certainty of his presence. Julian's hand slid from hers to the back of her neck, guiding her gently, deepening the kiss with careful patience. The carriage seemed to vanish around them, the clatter of the train, the dim light, even the passing darkness outside the window faded into insignificance. All that remained was the heat between them, the fire that had grown steadily since the first fleeting glance. Clara responded instinctively, leaning into him, matching the rhythm of his movements, surrendering to the pull that had become impossible to resist. Her heart hammered in her chest, her breath mingling with his, every kiss leaving a trail of warmth that spread through her body. The small compartment felt smaller still, the walls pressing in, enclosing them in their own private world. He pulled back just slightly, resting his forehead against hers, his voice low and husky. "You have no idea how long I've wanted this," he whispered, his breath hot against her skin. "Every moment, every glance. I've felt it." Clara's cheeks flushed, the warmth spreading through her like wildfire. I felt it too," she admitted, her voice trembling with the intensity of her emotions. "From the moment we met." Julian's lips brushed hers again, softer this time, almost reverent, as if savoring every second. His hand slid from her neck to her shoulder, tracing the curve with careful, deliberate movements, making her shiver at the touch. The heat between them deepened, a slow, steady burn that made it impossible to think about anything else. Clara's fingers found their way to the buttons of his jacket, a subtle, almost tentative motion, but it spoke volumes. She wanted to feel closer, to bridge the space that still remained, to immerse herself fully in this shared moment of desire. Julian responded with a small, approving smile, his hands guiding her gently, encouraging her without force, letting the tension stretch and coil, pulling them deeper into each other. The train rounded another curve, and the swaying motion seemed to mirror the rhythm they had established, a subtle, unspoken dance. Clara pressed closer, feeling the heat of his body, the strength in his arms, the steady beat of his pulse beneath her fingertips. Every sense was heightened, every touch, every whisper, every breath was amplified, feeding the fire that had consumed them both. For a long moment, they simply held each other, caught in the shared heat, the magnetic pull that had drawn them together from the start. The world outside no longer mattered. Time itself seemed suspended in the small carriage, leaving only the two of them and the undeniable, simmering tension that had finally erupted. Julian's lips found hers again, slower this time, more deliberate, tasting, exploring, claiming. Clara responded in kind, her hands moving over him, tracing the lines of his form, memorizing the heat, the presence, the man who had become both a mystery and a necessity. The first kiss had broken the dam, releasing everything that had been building between them. And as the train carried them further into the night, Clara realized that nothing would ever feel ordinary again. Every glance, every touch, every heartbeat was now shared, and the heat in the carriage was more than physical. It was the beginning of something that neither of them could resist, a connection that would only grow more intense with each passing mile. The train's rhythmic clatter seemed almost hypnotic now, matching the racing of Clara's heartbeat as she leaned closer to Julian. The world outside the carriage had become irrelevant, the night, the tracks, the darkness, none of it mattered. Only the heat between them existed, a living, pulsing force that neither could ignore. Julian's hands moved with deliberate care, tracing the curve of her shoulders, the line of her arms, every touch electrifying in its subtlety. Clara felt a shiver run through her body, her pulse quickening as if each heartbeat were a drum announcing their shared desire. The space between them was small, intimate, and the tension crackled in the air like static before a storm. "You're incredible," Julian murmured, his lips brushing against her temple. "Even like this, quiet, restrained, you draw me in completely. Clara's breath caught, the words fueling the fire that had been building since their first glance. She leaned closer, her lips brushing his jawline, a teasing, delicate touch that spoke volumes without saying a word. Julian responded immediately, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was deeper, more urgent than before. The compartment seemed to shrink further, the walls pressing in, enclosing them in their private world of heat and desire. Every kiss, every touch, every shared breath was amplified in the confined space. Clara felt her senses heighten, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the warmth of his skin, the rhythm of the train beneath them echoing the rhythm of their connection. Julian's hands moved to her waist, pulling her gently but firmly against him. The heat of his body pressed into hers, and Clara felt a delicious tension coil in her stomach. She tilted her head back slightly, letting him take the lead, surrendering to the magnetic pull that had been growing stronger with every passing moment. "You have no idea how much I've wanted this," he whispered against her lips, his voice low and husky. "Since the moment I saw you, I've been waiting for this, waiting for you to let yourself feel it too. I can't stop it," Clara admitted, her voice trembling with a mixture of longing and fear. "I don't want to stop it." Julian's hands tightened slightly around her waist, pulling her closer. The warmth between them had become almost unbearable, each touch sending waves of heat through her body. The kiss deepened, slower now, almost reverent, as if he were memorizing every reaction, every subtle shift of her body, every shiver, every breath. Clara's fingers found their way to the buttons of his shirt, teasing, brushing, exploring. Julian responded with a low, approving murmur, guiding her hands gently, encouraging her without words. The intimacy between them grew, each movement deliberate, careful, yet charged with undeniable desire. The train rocked gently, the motion adding a subtle rhythm to their closeness. Clara's head rested against his chest for a moment, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling the warmth of his body beneath her. The sensation was intoxicating, grounding yet exhilarating, a mix of comfort and raw anticipation that left her breathless. Julian's lips brushed her hairline, then her cheek, then back to her lips, each kiss slower, deeper, a constant exploration that left no space for doubt or hesitation. Clara melted into him, letting go of every restraint, every hesitation. The heat between them was no longer subtle, it had become an undeniable force, a fire that consumed and demanded. For a long moment, they simply held each other, caught in the shared intensity, the magnetic pull that had brought them together in this fleeting, suspended space. Outside, the night pressed on, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the small carriage. Inside, every glance, every touch, every heartbeat was theirs alone, a private world of fire and desire. Julian's lips found hers once more, slow and deliberate, tasting, teasing, claiming. Clara responded instinctively, her hands exploring, memorizing, surrendering fully to the heat that had become all-consuming. The train carried them forward into the night, but time seemed irrelevant, all that existed was the shared intensity, the undeniable connection, the fire that had begun with a glance and now burned brighter than either could have imagined. And as the carriage hummed around them, Clara realized with both thrill and surrender that the journey wasn't just a passage through the night, it was a journey into something new, something dangerous, something unforgettable. The train had entered a long, quiet stretch, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels softened by distance and the curve of the tracks inside the carriage. However, time seemed to have slowed to a suspended heartbeat, each second stretching, charged with the intensity that had grown between Clara and Julian. The confined space was no longer just a compartment, it was a crucible, where heat, desire, and anticipation had been building to a point that neither could deny. Clara's fingers traced the line of Julian's jaw, memorizing the subtle curve, the way his lips parted ever so slightly under her touch. Julian's hands had moved to her waist again, firm yet gentle, pulling her closer with a possessive tenderness that made her pulse race. Every movement, every brush of skin, every shared breath had become a language all their own. "You're breathtaking," Julian murmured, his lips hovering just above hers, the warmth of his breath mingling with hers. "Every second with you, it's unlike anything I've ever known." Clara's heart hammered in her chest. I feel the same," she whispered, her voice trembling, raw and unguarded. "I can't imagine feeling like this with anyone else." He smiled, slow and knowing, and pressed his lips to hers again, a kiss that was deeper, more consuming than any before. It was a kiss that spoke of desire, of longing, of surrender, yet carried a gentleness that made her melt into him. The carriage around them faded completely, the faint rattle of the train becoming a distant echo to the world they had created together. Julian's hand slid up to her shoulders, tracing the line of her neck, over her collarbone, eliciting small, involuntary shivers with each movement. Clara responded instinctively, her lips parting slightly, her body leaning closer, seeking the heat that had become her anchor, her addiction. The tension that had been simmering since the first glance was now a roaring flame, consuming every thought, every hesitation. "Clara," Julian's voice was husky, thick with emotion and something more primal, as he captured her lips again. "I need you to know. I've never wanted anyone like this before." Her breath caught. I've never felt like this either," she admitted, her fingers tangling in his hair, drawing him impossibly closer. "It's overwhelming." He kissed her again, slower now, savoring the moment, the taste, the warmth, the connection. Their bodies pressed together fully now, knees brushing, shoulders touching, hearts hammering in sync. Each kiss, each gentle caress, each subtle movement was an affirmation, a promise, a surrender to the undeniable force that had drawn them together. The swaying of the train added a rhythm to their closeness, a subtle, almost sensual cadence that mirrored the pulse of desire between them. Julian's hands moved with careful intent, memorizing every curve, every contour, eliciting soft gasps and shivers from Clara. She felt heat pooling inside her, a fire that had grown slowly but surely, now burning bright and uncontainable. "I don't want this night to end," she whispered against his lips, a confession and a plea all at once. Julian's lips curved into a tender, fierce smile. "Neither do I," he murmured, pressing a final, lingering kiss that sealed their shared desire. "Tonight is ours. Whatever the world outside says, it can't touch this." The train rattled onward, cutting through the night, but inside the carriage, time seemed irrelevant. Clara rested against Julian's chest, their foreheads touching, breathing mingled, hearts beating together in a rhythm that belonged only to them. Every lingering touch, every soft murmur, every kiss had transformed the compartment into a world apart, a cocoon of heat, desire, and intimacy. For a long moment, they simply held each other, the fire between them simmering gently now, a satisfaction that was both thrilling and comforting. Clara realized she had surrendered fully not just to the desire, but to the connection, the undeniable bond that had formed between them in a matter of hours. Julian's hands traced gentle patterns along her back, and she felt a contentment, a thrill, a promise of more to come. The heat of the carriage, the intimacy, the closeness, it was no longer just a fleeting spark. It was a flame, steady, bright, and impossible to ignore. And as the train carried them through the night, Clara knew, with a thrill and certainty, that the journey had changed her forever. The ordinary world outside no longer mattered. All that remained was the fire they had ignited, the connection that had become their own, and the knowledge that wherever the tracks led, they would face it together, drawn always to the heat that had begun in that small carriage. The night stretched on, infinite, electric, and unforgettable, leaving Clara and Julian suspended in a moment that would live in memory long after the train reached its destination.